December 1986, 8 months after the Chernobyl disaster. A photographer named Artur Korniev stands in a dark basement corridor deep inside the destroyed reactor building. He's wearing protective gear, but it won't help much. Nothing can really protect you from what's in this room. He raises his camera and takes a photograph. The image comes out distorted, streaked with strange patterns. That's not a camera malfunction. That's radiation so intense it's physically damaging the film as the picture is taken. In the photograph, you can see a dark, twisted mass in the corner of the room. It looks like melted rock, like frozen lava. It has a wrinkled, uneven surface that vaguely resembles the texture of an elephant's foot. That's what they call it, the elephant's foot. This object is the most dangerous thing humanity has ever created. It's a mass of corium, a hellish combination of nuclear fuel, melted concrete, sand, and steel that formed when the Chernobyl reactor melted down. It's roughly 2 meters wide and weighs hundreds of tons. And it's so radioactive that standing near it for 5 minutes will kill you. Not eventually, not from cancer years later. It will kill you within days. Standing near it for 30 seconds gives you a lethal dose. Looking at it directly for 2 minutes guarantees you'll be dead within weeks. Artur Korniev, the photographer, absorbed enough radiation taking that picture that he should be dead. He took multiple trips down to photograph the elephant's foot over the years. By all conventional understanding of radiation exposure, he shouldn't have survived. But somehow he did. He's alive today, decades later, and nobody fully understands why. This is the story of the elephant's foot, the deadliest object on Earth, created in minutes, lethal for millennia. It's still there, in the basement of Chernobyl, radiating death into the darkness. And there's nothing we can do about it. The night everything went wrong. April 26, 1986, 1:23 a.m., Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Soviet Ukraine. Reactor number 4 is about to experience the worst nuclear disaster in history. But before we talk about what happened, you need to understand what a reactor meltdown actually means. Nuclear reactors work by controlling a chain reaction. Uranium atoms split, releasing energy and neutrons. Those neutrons hit other uranium atoms, causing them to split. This produces heat, which boils water, which creates steam, which spins turbines, which generates electricity. The key word is controlling. You need to keep the reaction going fast enough to produce power, but slow enough that it doesn't run away. It's like keeping a fire at exactly the right temperature, hot enough to cook your food, not hot enough to burn down your house. At Chernobyl, they lost control. The reaction accelerated, faster and faster. More atoms splitting, releasing more neutrons, causing more splits. The reactor temperature skyrocketed. The fuel rods, cylinders of uranium ceramic, began to melt. They weren't supposed to melt. Nothing in the reactor was supposed to melt. But the temperature climbed to over 2,000 degrees Celsius. The uranium melted. The zirconium cladding around the fuel rods melted. Then the steel. Then the concrete. The explosion. At 1:23 and 45 seconds a.m., Reactor 4 exploded. Not once, but twice. The first explosion was steam, water instantly vaporizing from the incredible heat. The second was likely a prompt criticality, a surge in the nuclear reaction that basically turned the reactor into a crude nuclear bomb for a fraction of a second. The 1,000-ton steel and concrete lid covering the reactor, they called it Elena, was blown completely off. It flipped up into the air and landed at an angle, partially leaning back into the reactor opening. The building's roof was destroyed, the walls cracked, and the reactor core, now exposed to open air, began burning. Graphite, the material used to moderate the nuclear reaction, was on fire. Nuclear fuel was burning. Everything that should never, ever be exposed to the atmosphere was now belching radioactive smoke into the night sky. But the real horror was happening below, where nobody could see it. The meltdown. While everyone was focused on the fire and explosion, something worse was happening in the reactor vault, the massive concrete chamber below the reactor itself. Remember all that melted fuel? It had to go somewhere, and it went down. Imagine lava, but worse. Nuclear lava. A molten mixture of uranium dioxide, the nuclear fuel, zirconium, from the fuel rod cladding, steel from the reactor components, graphite from the reactor moderator, sand and concrete from the reactor walls and foundation, all of it liquefied into a hellish mixture exceeding 2,600 degrees Celsius. This substance has a name, corium. It's sometimes called the elephant's foot of Chernobyl or molten core concrete interaction. Corium is one of the most dangerous substances possible. It's intensely radioactive, not just the radiation you'd expect from nuclear fuel, but a complex mixture of dozens of radioactive isotopes, all decaying at different rates, emitting different types of radiation. And this corium began flowing downward through the reactor building like lava through a volcano. The journey downward. The corium burned through the reactor vessel. It melted through the floor of the reactor chamber. It flowed down corridors and stairwells, seeking the lowest points in the building, driven by gravity and its own intense heat. In some places, it melted through metal doors. In others, it burned through concrete floors. It moved like a slow, deadly tide through the basement levels of the reactor building. Some of this molten mass spread out into thin layers as it cooled. Some of it pooled in larger masses. And in one particular room, a corridor in the basement beneath the reactor, a large quantity of corium flowed through a hole in the ceiling and began to accumulate. As it pooled and cooled, it formed into a shape roughly 2 meters wide with a wrinkled, folded surface. The texture, the color, the shape, it looked disturbingly like an elephant's foot. The elephant's foot was born. What makes it so deadly? To understand why the elephant's foot is so dangerous, you need to understand radiation. When people talk about radiation, they're usually talking about 3 main types: alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma rays. Each type has different properties and dangers. The elephant's foot emits all of them intensely. In 1986, when it first formed, the radiation level next to the elephant's foot was approximately 10,000 Roentgens per hour. To put that in perspective, 400 Roentgens total exposure equals 50% chance of death. 1,000 Roentgens total exposure equals certain death within days. Standing next to the elephant's foot for 5 minutes equals 1,000 plus Roentgens. Standing next to it for 30 seconds equals lethal dose. This wasn't standing in front of it for an hour and maybe developing cancer years later. This was stand near it for minutes and you're guaranteed dead within 2 weeks. The radiation was so intense it would destroy human tissue at a cellular level. It would break down DNA, kill cells faster than they could be replaced. Within hours of exposure, you'd start experiencing acute radiation syndrome. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fever. Within days, your body would start to fail organ by organ, and that was just from being near it. If you touched it, you'd absorb such an enormous dose that death would come even faster and more painfully. The first discovery. For months after the disaster, nobody knew the elephant's foot existed. The basement levels of the reactor building were too dangerous to explore. The radiation levels in the destroyed reactor and surrounding areas were so high that any exploration had to be done by remote-controlled robots. The Soviets sent in robots. Many of them failed. The radiation was so intense it damaged their electronics. The robots would stop functioning, become irradiated trash left in the corridors. It took months before anyone could safely enter the lower levels to assess the damage. When they finally did, using careful timing and heavy protective gear, they discovered the corium flows. And then they found it, the largest single mass of corium in the building. The elephant's foot. The impossible task. After discovering the elephant's foot, Soviet scientists faced an impossible problem. They needed to study it, but they couldn't get near it without dying. Remember, in 1986, the elephant's foot was emitting approximately 10,000 Roentgens per hour. That's not a typo. 10,000. Even with protective gear, even with lead shielding, getting close to it meant absorbing potentially lethal radiation doses. So how do you photograph something that kills you if you look at it too long? Artur Korniev. This is where Artur Korniev enters the story. He was a senior researcher at the Chernobyl plant, a specialist in nuclear physics and radiation. After the disaster, he became part of the team documenting the damage inside the reactor building. He wasn't suicidal. He wasn't reckless. He was a scientist who understood exactly how dangerous this was. But someone had to document what was happening inside that building. Someone had to photograph the elephant's foot. The most famous photograph of the elephant's foot was taken in 1996, 10 years after the disaster. By this point, the radiation had decreased significantly. The most intensely radioactive isotopes had decayed. But it was still insanely dangerous. The photograph shows the elephant's foot in the corner of a room. A dark, rippled mass that looks almost organic. The image is heavily distorted, streaked with lines and artifacts. That's the radiation interacting with the film, creating glitches in the photograph even as it's being taken. Korniev took multiple photographs over the years. Each trip down to the basement meant absorbing radiation. Each photograph meant standing in that corridor, setting up equipment, taking the shot, and getting out as fast as possible. He absorbed an enormous cumulative dose of radiation. By conventional understanding, he should have developed severe health problems or died. Acute radiation syndrome, cancer, organ failure. Instead, he's alive today, in his 70s as of 2024. Still working, still relatively healthy. How? Nobody knows for sure. Possibly genetic factors that made him more resistant to radiation damage. Possibly just luck. Radiation exposure is somewhat probabilistic, and he happened to avoid the worst effects. Possibly his dosing was spread out over time in ways that allowed his body to repair some of the damage between exposures. But his survival is an anomaly. Most people exposed to similar cumulative doses died or suffered severe health consequences. What the photographs revealed. The photographs of the elephant's foot weren't just for documentation. They revealed important information about what was happening inside the reactor building. Scientists could see that the corium had cooled into a stable, solid mass. It wasn't melting through the floor anymore. It wasn't moving. The immediate danger of the corium burning all the way through the foundation and potentially contaminating groundwater had passed. But they could also see that the elephant's foot was slowly changing. The surface was cracking. Small pieces were flaking off. This was concerning. If the corium became unstable, if it started breaking apart into dust, it could spread radioactive contamination through the building. They could also measure, using remote sensors and calculations based on the film damage, how radioactive the elephant's foot still was. And the answer was extremely. The decay curve. Radioactive decay follows a predictable pattern. Different isotopes decay at different rates, measured in half-lives, the time it takes for half of the atoms to decay. The elephant's foot contains a mixture of many radioactive isotopes. Cesium-137, half-life, 30 years. Strontium-90, half-life, 29 years. Plutonium-239, half-life, 24,000 years. Uranium-235, half-life, 704 million years. The short-lived isotopes, things with half-lives of days or months, decayed quickly. Within the first year, the elephant's foot's radiation level dropped significantly as these isotopes burned out. But the medium and long-lived isotopes remain. In 1996, when the famous photograph was taken, the radiation level was still around 1,000 Roentgens per hour. Lethal in minutes instead of seconds, but still absolutely deadly. Today, in 2024, the radiation has decreased further. Current estimates suggest it's somewhere around 80 to 100 Roentgens per hour near the elephant's foot. That's still incredibly dangerous. You could stand near it for maybe 30 minutes to an hour before absorbing a potentially lethal dose, but it's a fraction of what it once was. Here's the disturbing part. Even at this reduced level, the elephant's foot will remain lethally radioactive for centuries, possibly millennia. The plutonium and uranium in the corium have such long half-lives that they'll be dangerous long after human civilization as we know it has ended. Other corium formations. The elephant's foot is the most famous corium formation at Chernobyl, but it's not the only one. As scientists explored the basement levels, they found other corium flows and formations. There's what they call brown ceramic formations, solidified corium that took on different colors and textures depending on its composition and cooling rate. Some flows look like black glass. Others are brown or gray. Some are crystalline, others are rough and porous. In total, There are probably hundreds of tons of corium scattered throughout the lower levels of the reactor building. Some in large masses like the elephant's foot, others in thin flows coating walls and floors. It's all deadly. It's all going to remain deadly for a very long time. The bacteria discovery. In the late 1990s, scientists made a bizarre discovery. Growing on the walls near the elephant's foot, they found black fungus, a type of radiotrophic fungus that actually feeds on radiation. This sounds like science fiction, but it's real. These fungi contain melanin, the same pigment that darkens human skin. Somehow, they can use melanin to convert gamma radiation into chemical energy, similar to how plants use chlorophyll to convert sunlight into energy through photosynthesis. The fungus growing near the elephant's foot is literally eating radiation. It's thriving in an environment that would kill almost any other living thing within minutes. This discovery has implications for everything from space exploration, radiation protection for astronauts, to bioremediation, using organisms to clean up nuclear contamination. But it's also just deeply weird. Life, finding a way to survive even in the presence of one of the most hostile substances ever created. The sarcophagus. After the disaster, the Soviets faced a massive problem. The destroyed reactor was spewing radiation into the atmosphere. They needed to contain it immediately. In an incredible feat of engineering and human sacrifice, they built what they called the object shelter, but what everyone else calls the sarcophagus. It was a massive concrete and steel structure built directly over the destroyed reactor, essentially entombing it. Construction began in May 1986, less than a month after the disaster. Thousands of workers, called liquidators, built the sarcophagus under the most hellish conditions imaginable. They worked in intense radiation, in shifts measured in seconds or minutes to minimize exposure. Many absorbed lethal doses. Many died. By November 1986, the sarcophagus was complete. It sealed the reactor and the elephant's foot inside, preventing most of the radiation from escaping into the environment. But there was a problem. The sarcophagus was built in a hurry. It wasn't designed to last forever. It was an emergency measure, a bandage on a wound that needed surgery. The sarcophagus deteriorates. Over the years, the sarcophagus began to fall apart. Radiation damaged the concrete and steel. Weather eroded it. The structure was never waterproof. Rain leaked in, pooling in the basement levels near the corium formations. This created the risk of criticality accidents. If enough water accumulated around the corium, it could moderate a nuclear chain reaction, essentially creating an uncontrolled reactor again. By the 1990s, large sections of the sarcophagus were unstable. There was a genuine risk it could collapse, releasing massive amounts of radioactive dust into the atmosphere. If that happened during bad weather, contamination could spread across Europe again. The elephant's foot, sitting in its basement corridor, was still there, still deadly, still radiating. And the structure containing it was failing. The new safe confinement. In the 2000s, an international effort began to build a permanent solution. The new safe confinement, NSC. This would be the largest movable land-based structure ever built. Imagine an arch-shaped hangar large enough to completely cover the destroyed reactor building and the old sarcophagus. That's what they built. It's 257 meters wide, 162 meters long, and 108 meters tall. It weighs 36,000 tons. The NSC was built on rails, next to the reactor, then carefully moved into place over the old sarcophagus. This approach was necessary because building directly over the reactor would expose workers to too much radiation. By building it nearby and moving it into position, they minimized exposure. In November 2016, exactly 30 years after the original sarcophagus was completed, the new safe confinement was moved into place. It now covers the entire site, designed to last 100 years. Inside the NSC, engineers installed remote-controlled cranes and equipment. The plan is to eventually dismantle the old sarcophagus and begin removing the radioactive materials inside, including the corium formations. Eventually, that's the key word. The problem that won't go away. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Nobody really knows what to do with the elephant's foot and the other corium formations. You can't just pick them up and move them. They're intensely radioactive. They're also incredibly heavy and brittle. Trying to break them apart might create radioactive dust that could spread contamination. You can't melt them down or chemically process them. They're already the end product of a meltdown, a mixture of materials that can't be easily separated. You can't leave them where they are forever. The building is unstable, and eventually even the new safe confinement will need to be replaced. The current plan is to eventually remove the corium and store it in special containers designed for long-term nuclear waste storage. But eventually might mean decades. The radiation levels need to decrease further. The technology needs to improve. The funding needs to be available. In the meantime, the elephant's foot sits in its dark corridor, waiting. Still deadly, still radioactive, still the most dangerous object on Earth. The cost in lives. It's impossible to know exactly how many people died because of Chernobyl. The Soviet government covered up and minimized casualty figures. Many deaths occurred years later from cancer and other radiation-related illnesses, making causation difficult to prove. Official Soviet figures claim only 31 people died directly from the disaster. That's obviously false. It only counts immediate deaths from acute radiation syndrome and trauma, not the firefighters, liquidators, and plant workers who died in the weeks and months afterward. More realistic estimates range from 4,000 to 93,000 eventual deaths from cancer caused by the radiation release. The true number is probably somewhere in that wide range, and we'll never know exactly. What we do know is that thousands of liquidators, the people who built the sarcophagus, who cleaned up the site, who fought to contain the disaster, absorbed enormous doses of radiation. Many died within years. Others developed cancers and other health problems that killed them decades later. And the elephant's foot is still there, still radioactive, a monument to the disaster and the lives it took. The exclusion zone today. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone is a strange place. It's 2,600 square kilometers of abandoned cities and towns, frozen in time since 1986. Pripyat, the city built for Chernobyl plant workers, is a ghost town. Apartment buildings stand empty. An amusement park, set to open on May 1, 1986, just days after the disaster, remains unused, its Ferris wheel rusting, a symbol of futures that never happened. But the zone isn't completely empty. There are workers who maintain the plant and the containment structures. There are scientists studying the effects of radiation on the environment. There are even a few elderly people who refuse to evacuate and have been living in the zone for decades, seemingly healthy despite the radiation. And there are tourists, thousands of them each year, taking guided tours through the abandoned cities, posing for photos in front of radioactive landmarks. The radiation levels in most of the zone have decreased to levels considered relatively safe for short-term exposure. But not in the reactor building. Not in the basement where the elephant's foot waits. That area remains off-limits, too dangerous for anyone to visit except briefly, and only with extensive protective equipment and monitoring. What Chernobyl taught us. The Chernobyl disaster and the elephant's foot taught humanity several sobering lessons about nuclear power and the limits of our control. First, nuclear disasters aren't like other industrial accidents. When a factory explodes or a building collapses, you clean up the damage and rebuild. When a reactor melts down, you create something that will remain dangerous for thousands of years. The elephant's foot is a problem that will outlast empires, that will still be deadly when our current civilization is ancient history. Second, there are some things we create that we cannot undo. We can build reactors, but once they melt down, we can't unmelt them. We can't make the elephant's foot safe. We can only contain it, wait for it to decay, and hope our containment structures last long enough. Third, the true cost of nuclear accidents is incalculable. Not just in lives lost and health damaged, but in land rendered uninhabitable, in communities destroyed, in the permanent alteration of the environment. The question of nuclear power. The elephant's foot exists at the center of the debate about nuclear energy. On one hand, modern reactors are far safer than the RBMK design used at Chernobyl. New reactor designs have passive safety features that make Chernobyl-style accidents essentially impossible. On the other hand, the elephant's foot proves that when nuclear power goes wrong, it goes catastrophically, permanently wrong. It creates problems that last for geological timescales. The elephant's foot is a physical manifestation of the nuclear power dilemma. Immense energy, incredible potential, but with consequences that can never be fully erased if things go wrong. Other corium in the world. Chernobyl isn't the only place where corium exists. The 3 Mile Island accident in 1979 produced corium, though in much smaller quantities and fully contained within the reactor vessel. And Fukushima, after the 2011 disaster, produced corium in 3 reactors. The corium at Fukushima is, in some ways, an even bigger problem than Chernobyl's because it's in contact with groundwater. The plant has been continuously pumping contaminated water since the disaster, with no clear end in sight. Each corium formation is a unique nightmare. Each one proves that once you create this substance, you own it forever. You can't destroy it, you can't make it safe, you can only manage it for as long as human civilization exists to do the managing. The far future. Think about this. The elephant's foot will still be radioactive in the year 3000. It will still be dangerous in the year 10,000. In the year 25,000, when humans might have evolved into something we wouldn't recognize, when our current languages are as dead as ancient Sumerian, the elephant's foot will still be there, still radioactive. How do you mark a danger that will last that long? How do you warn future humans or whatever comes after us not to disturb this thing? We've created a hazard that will outlast any warning we could possibly leave. This is one of the challenges facing nuclear waste storage, creating warnings that will remain comprehensible for tens of thousands of years. Some proposals suggest building monuments with warnings in images, since pictures might be more universally understood than language. Others suggest creating an atomic priesthood, whose cultural mission would be to pass down warnings about nuclear sites for millennia. But even these solutions assume continuous human civilization. What if there's a collapse? What if knowledge is lost? The elephant's foot will still be there, waiting in the dark, to kill whoever stumbles upon it. The monument to hubris. The elephant's foot is many things. It's a mass of radioactive corium. It's the deadliest object on Earth. It's a scientific curiosity. But perhaps most importantly, it's a monument. A monument to human hubris, to the limits of our control, to the permanent consequences of our mistakes. We split the atom thinking we could control it, and we can most of the time, but that most of the time isn't good enough when the consequences of failure last for millennia. The elephant's foot sits in its dark basement, entombed beneath layers of concrete and steel. It's still there right now as you watch this, still radioactive, still deadly, still waiting. Artur Korniev, the man who photographed it and survived, once said, "The elephant's foot will be there for a very long time, longer than any of us, longer than our children's children." It's a reminder that some things, once done, cannot be undone. In 1986, for a few catastrophic hours, we lost control of a nuclear reactor. In those hours, we created something that will outlast empires, that will remain dangerous long after everyone alive today is dust, that represents perhaps the longest-lasting consequence of any single event in human history. The elephant's foot isn't just radioactive material. It's frozen time. Its consequences made physical. It's the moment of disaster preserved forever in a mass of deadly matter. And it's still there, in the darkness, waiting, the most dangerous object on Earth, created by accident, impossible to destroy, a problem that will outlast nations. The elephant's foot, the thing we made that we can never unmake. And it will be there, in that basement, radiating death into the darkness, long after everyone who remembers Chernobyl is gone.